the fall of the Roman Empire. He was a gentle ruler, more at home in the Senate than in a military camp. He believed in diplomacy, in negotiation. He sought to buy peace from the Germanic tribes, to pay them tribute rather than spill Roman blood. To the hardened soldiers of the frontier, men who saw war as a source of wealth, glory, and purpose. This was not statesmanship, it was cowardice. It was an insult. The whispers began in the tents, fueled by ambitious officers. They spoke of a new kind of leader, a man of action, a soldier like them. His name was Maximinus Thrax, a giant of a man, they said, risen from the peasantry of Thrace. With the death of the young emperor, the last thread connecting Rome to the age of the great Antonines was cut. An era of stability, however frayed, was over. An age of iron and blood was about to begin. The murder of an emperor was not a new phenomenon in Roman history. But this was different. This was not a palace coup orchestrated by the Praetorian Guard, nor the outcome of a declared civil war. This was the army, the very shield of the empire, turning on its master for reasons of policy and pay. In elevating Maximinus Thrax, the soldiers set a dangerous precedent that the throne of the Caesars could be seized by anyone with enough swords to back their claim. It was an invitation to anarchy, and anarchy answered. The half-century that followed is known to history as the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a time when the Roman Empire, a civilization that had seemed as permanent as the stars, was pushed to the very brink of collapse. It was a relentless cascade of calamities. Civil war, foreign invasion, plague, and economic ruin, each feeding the others in a devastating cycle. The chaos began almost at once. The Roman Senate, a body of ancient prestige but dwindling power, was appalled that a man they considered a low-born barbarian was now emperor. In the year 238, they backed a rebellion in Africa. This ignited a furious civil war that saw emperor rise and fall with the turning of the seasons. History remembers it as the year of the 6 emperors, a blur of names and battles, a testament to the profound instability that now gripped the state. By the year's end, Maximinus Thrax himself was dead, murdered by his own weary troops during a siege in Italy. The empire had devoured its first soldier emperor, but the hunger for violence remained. For the next 50 years, the imperial purple became a death shroud. More than 25 men would claim the title of emperor, and nearly all would die violently. They were the barracks emperors, generals pushed into power by their legions, ruling only as long as they could keep their soldiers paid and loyal. They rarely saw the city of Rome, their reigns spent in constant motion, rushing from one threatened frontier to the next. The empire no longer had a stable centre. Its capital was wherever the emperor and his army happened to make camp. This internal bleeding left the empire's long borders fatally exposed. To the north, along the Danube and the Rhine, Germanic tribes like the Goths and the Alemanni saw their chance. They were not a unified horde, but a collection of peoples displaced by migration, climate change, and their own internal conflicts. They crossed the frontiers not always to conquer, but to raid, to plunder, or to find new lands to settle. They sacked cities in Greece and Asia Minor, places that had not seen a foreign invader for centuries. In the east, a far more organized and dangerous threat had emerged. The old Parthian Empire had been replaced by the aggressive Sasanian Empire of Persia. The Sasanians saw themselves as the heirs to the ancient Persian kings, and they dreamed of reclaiming the lands of the Middle East from Roman control. They were a sophisticated, centralized state, capable of fielding massive, well-led armies. As if the endless wars were not enough, another, more insidious enemy arrived. Around the year 251, a terrifying pestilence, known as the Plague of Cyprian, began to sweep through the empire. We cannot know for certain what the disease was, perhaps smallpox, perhaps a hemorrhagic fever, but its effects were catastrophic. At its peak, it was said to have killed 5,000 people a day in the city of Rome alone. It ravaged the countryside and the military camps, hollowing out the population. It crippled the economy, shattered communities, and left the legions critically short of manpower. An empire already bleeding from self-inflicted wounds was now being drained of its very lifeblood. The nadir, the absolute lowest point of Roman fortunes, arrived in the year 260. The emperor of the time was a man named Valerian. He was an older, aristocratic ruler, a throwback to a more stable age, and he was completely unprepared for the storm he had inherited. Leading an army against the Sasanian king, Shapur I, near the city of Edessa, Valerian was outmaneuvered, surrounded, and defeated. What happened next was unthinkable. The Roman emperor, the living embodiment of the world's greatest power, was captured by the enemy. For the first time in its long history, a Caesar became a prisoner of a foreign king. Sasanian rock carvings, still visible today, depict the scene in humiliating detail. Valerian kneeling, his hands outstretched, before a triumphant Shapur on horseback. The psychological blow to Roman prestige was immeasurable. The news rippled across the world. Rome was not invincible. The eagle was wounded, perhaps mortally. With the emperor in chains and the central government in disarray, the empire began to break apart. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Hispania seceded, forming their own independent state, now known as the Gallic Empire. Its rulers did not see themselves as traitors. They saw themselves as defenders of the Roman way of life, creating a state capable of protecting the Rhine frontier when Rome itself could not. A similar splintering occurred in the east. In the wealthy desert city of Palmyra, the local ruler, Odoacer, had successfully fought back against the Persians. After his death, his brilliant and ambitious widow, Zenobia, took power. She carved out a vast domain for herself, the Palmyrian Empire, encompassing Syria, Palestine, and even the vital province of Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome. It was fractured into three warring pieces. A Gallic emperor ruled from Trier, Queen Zenobia ruled from Palmyra, and the succession of weak emperors in Rome struggled to hold on to Italy and the central provinces. It seemed that the end had finally come. But the story of Rome is one of remarkable resilience. Just as all seemed lost, the tide began to turn. The recovery was not led by wise senators or noble aristocrats, but by a series of grim, hard-bitten soldier emperors from the Danubian provinces of Illyria. They were men of common birth, professional soldiers who had risen through the ranks on merit alone. They were ruthless, tireless, and utterly dedicated to the preservation of the Roman state. The first of these great restorers was Claudius Gothicus. In the year 268 or 269, he confronted a massive invasion of Goths at the Battle of Naissus in modern-day Serbia. It was a bloody, desperate fight, but Claudius won a crushing victory. He shattered the Gothic army, ending their threat for a generation. It was a pivotal moment, a sign that the legions, when well led, were still the most formidable fighting force in the world. Claudius died of the plague shortly after his great victory, but he was succeeded by a man of even greater energy and vision, Aurelian. Reigning for just 5 years, from 270 to 275, Aurelian accomplished what had seemed impossible. He was a man in constant motion, a whirlwind of military campaigning. He drove barbarian invaders back across the Danube. He built a massive new set of defensive walls around the city of Rome, a stark admission that the capital was no longer safe. Then he turned his attention to the breakaway empires. First, he marched east against Zenobia and her Palmyrian empire. After a swift and brilliant campaign, he captured Palmyra and took the queen herself prisoner. He marched her back to Rome in golden chains to be displayed in his triumph. Then he turned west toward the Gallic Empire. In a great battle in Gaul, he defeated the secessionist army and brought the western provinces back into the fold. By late 274, the Roman Empire was, against all odds, a single entity once more. Aurelian had earned the title bestowed upon him by the Senate, Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. He had stitched the shattered empire back together. Yet the crisis was not truly over. The underlying problems, a broken economy, a rebellious army, and overstretched frontiers, remained. Aurelian himself, the great restorer, was assassinated by his own officers in 275, a victim of the same military anarchy he had fought to contain. For another decade the empire stumbled on, led by a quick succession of short-lived emperors. The reunification held, but the peace was fragile. The wounds ran deep. In the year 284, as he surveyed the Roman world, he saw an empire that had survived, but at a terrible cost. Dozens of cities lay in ruins. Great stretches of farmland had been abandoned. The old silver currency was worthless, debased by decades of desperate emperors minting coins with less and less precious metal. The trust between the ruler and the ruled, between the army and the state, was broken. The empire had been reunited by force of arms, but Diocletian understood, with the cold clarity of a soldier, that force alone would not be enough to save it. The old system, the system that had governed Rome for 3 centuries, had failed. It had shattered under the immense pressures of the crisis. To prevent it from collapsing again, it could not simply be repaired. It had to be remade. A new, more autocratic, more rigid, and more resilient Roman state would have to be forged from the wreckage of the old. The age of the barracks emperors was over. The age of the dominate, of the absolute monarch, was about to begin. The shattered eagle was whole again, but he would fly in a very different sky. Chapter 2. The Last Unity. The sheer scale of the Roman world had become both its glory and its curse. From the misty frontiers of Britannia to the sun-scorched borders of Syria, a single emperor could no longer hope to command, to defend, to simply govern. The crisis of the 3rd century had proven this with 50 years of blood and chaos. For Diocletian, the soldier emperor who had inherited this fragile peace, the solution could not be found in the past. It had to be invented. His solution was a radical reimagining of power itself. In the year 293 he formally established the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. It was not a dynasty of blood, but a machine of state. 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, would rule the east and west. Beneath them, 2 junior emperors, the Caesares, would act as their deputies and designated heirs. 4 rulers, 4 mobile courts, 4 armies ready to meet threats on any frontier simultaneously. It was a cold, pragmatic answer to an age of anarchy. For a time, it worked. The borders were stabilized. The administration was reformed. A sense of order returned to the provinces. Then, in 305, Diocletian did the unthinkable. He voluntarily retired, compelling his fellow Augustus, Maximian, to do the same. It was the ultimate test of his new system, a peaceful, planned transfer of power. The 2 Caesares were elevated, and new juniors were appointed. The machine, it seemed, was functioning as designed. But Diocletian had failed to account for one critical element: human ambition. The machine he had built to suppress the endless cycle of civil war soon became its grand prize. The sons of the old emperors, who had been passed over by the system, made their own claims. The armies, loyal to men rather than ideals, proclaimed their generals as rulers. Diocletian's carefully constructed order shattered, and the empire plunged back into a series of cascading civil wars. From this crucible of conflict, one figure would emerge to dominate the age. His name was Constantine. He was the son of a Caesar, proclaimed emperor by his troops in far-off York. For nearly 2 decades he fought his rivals for control of the West. His final challenge came in the year 312, on the approach to Rome itself, against the forces of Maxentius. It was here, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, that history took a profound and unexpected turn. According to the Christian historian Eusebius, Constantine looked to the heavens and saw a cross of light above the sun, inscribed with the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." That night he dreamt that he was commanded to mark the shields of his soldiers with the Chi-Rho, a symbol representing the name of Christ. He obeyed. The next day his outnumbered army drove the forces of Maxentius into the Tiber River. Constantine marched into Rome not just as a conqueror, but as the chosen instrument of a new and powerful god. The victory at the Milvian Bridge was more than a military triumph, it was a spiritual revolution. The Roman state, which had for centuries persecuted Christians, now had an emperor who openly favoured their faith. 12 years later, in 324, Constantine defeated his last rival, Licinius, at the Battle of Chrysopolis. The Tetrarchy was dead. The civil wars were over. The Roman world was once again united under the rule of a single man. But this was not the empire of Augustus or even of Diocletian. It was an empire whose destiny was now entwined with the Christian cross, its spiritual foundations irrevocably altered. Constantine had given the empire a new god and a new capital, Constantinople, the new Rome, on the Bosphorus. He had restored unity through force of arms and force of faith. Yet the fundamental problems that had plagued the empire for a century had not vanished. The economy was fragile. The bureaucracy was vast and expensive, and beyond the Danube, new pressures were building that would soon test this restored unity to its breaking point. Decades passed. The dynasty of Constantine rose and fell. And then, in the late 4th century, a storm broke upon the frontiers. A terrifying new people, the Huns, had swept out of the Central Asian steppes, driving all before them. The Gothic tribes, who had lived along the Danube for generations, were thrown into a panic. In 376 they appeared on the banks of the river in desperate numbers, not as raiders, but as refugees, begging for asylum within the Roman Empire. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, granted their request. It was a fateful decision, poorly managed. Corrupt Roman officials exploited the starving Goths, stealing their food, selling their children into slavery, and driving them to the point of rebellion. A people who had entered the empire as supplicants now rose up as a furious internal enemy. Valens, underestimating the scale of the threat, marched out to crush the uprising himself. On the 9th of August, in the year 3078, the Eastern Roman field army met the Gothic host on a sweltering plain near the city of Adrianople. The battle was a catastrophe on a scale not seen since Hannibal had annihilated the legions at Cannae 6 centuries earlier. The Roman cavalry was scattered, the infantry encircled and overwhelmed. By the end of the day, 2/3 of the army lay dead on the field. With them lay the Emperor Valens, his body never to be found. Adrianople was a devastating blow. It was not merely the loss of an army or an emperor, it was the shattering of an idea. The myth of Roman invincibility, already damaged by the 3rd century, was now broken. A barbarian army had not simply raided a province, it had annihilated the main army of the Eastern Empire and killed its ruler within Roman territory. The Goths were now a victorious, autonomous power lodged deep inside the imperial frontiers, and Rome lacked the manpower to drive them out. Into this crisis stepped a Spanish general named Theodosius. Appointed as the new Eastern Emperor, he inherited a disaster. He fought the Goths to a standstill, but he could not defeat them. In the end, he was forced to do what was once unthinkable. In 382, he signed a treaty that allowed the Goths to settle permanently within the empire, not as conquered subjects, but as a self-governing nation bound by treaty to serve in the Roman army. It was a necessary compromise, but one that created a dangerous precedent, a barbarian state within the state. Theodosius, who would come to be known as the Great, sought to impose a different kind of unity on the fractured empire. He was a fervent follower of Nicene Christianity, and he would not tolerate the heresies and pagan traditions that still lingered. He issued a series of edicts that effectively outlawed public pagan worship and established his Orthodox creed as the sole official state religion of the Roman Empire. The sacred fires of Vesta were extinguished. The oracle at Delphi fell silent. The empire now had one ruler, one law, and one God. After a final, bloody civil war against the usurper in the west, Theodosius briefly achieved what Constantine had. In the year 394, he stood as the sole undisputed master of the entire Roman world, from the shores of the Atlantic to the banks of the Euphrates. It was the last time any single man would hold such power. This final moment of unity was fleeting, destined to last only a few months. In January of 395, Theodosius lay on his deathbed in Milan. He knew his two young sons were not strong enough to rule alone, nor to trust one another. With his final breath, he made a decision that would seal the fate of the West. He divided the empire between them. His elder son, Arcadius, would rule the wealthy, populous, and more stable east from Constantinople. His younger son, Honorius, would take the poorer, more rural, and dangerously exposed west, with its capital at Milan. This was not meant to be a permanent separation. In Roman legal theory, the empire remained a single, indivisible entity, merely administered from two centers. But this time it was different. The two halves would never again be reunited. They would drift apart, developing separate courts, separate armies, and separate destinies. The last unity was over. The Western Roman Empire, now politically severed from the strength and resources of the East, was left to face the coming storm alone. Chapter 3. The Great Unravelling. In the Western court at Milan, the imperial purple rested on the shoulders of a child. Honorius, just 10 years old, was now Augustus of the West, a boy emperor in a world that had no time for boyhood. The true power, the pillar holding up the crumbling edifice of the state, was a man of Vandal birth named Stilicho. Stilicho was a master of the Roman military, the Magister Militum, and through his marriage to the niece of the great Theodosius, he had become family. He was now the emperor's father-in-law, his guardian, and the de facto ruler of the West. His was a near impossible task, to defend 1,000 miles of frontier with dwindling armies and an empty treasury, all while navigating the treacherous currents of a paranoid and suspicious court. The first great test came not from the distant Rhine or the plains of Pannonia, but from within the empire's own borders. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, the very people settled in the empire after the disaster at Adrianople, grew restless. He saw a child on the throne and an empire divided. He saw an opportunity. Leading his people out of the Balkans, he descended upon Italy itself, a spectre of the Gothic wars come again to haunt the heartland. Chapter. He stripped the legions from Gaul. He recalled troops from Britain. He gathered every available soldier into a single army to confront the Gothic king. At Pollentia, and again at Verona, he defeated Alaric, driving him from Italy. But the cost of this victory was steep. The frontiers, particularly the long, winding course of the Rhine, were left perilously exposed. The guards had been pulled from the walls to put out a fire in the courtyard. And so, on the final night of the year 406, a catastrophe occurred. The Rhine River, frozen solid by a bitter winter, became a bridge. A vast migration of peoples, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, pushed west by the relentless pressure of the Huns, crossed the ice into Roman Gaul. It was not a raid, but an exodus. An entire world of men, women, and children poured across the river, shattering the centuries-old frontier beyond any hope of repair. The great unravelling had begun. Britain, cut off from the continent, declared its independence and raised its own emperors. Spain would soon fall to the newcomers. Stilicho, the man who had saved Italy, was now blamed for the loss of its richest provinces. In the court at Ravenna, where Honorius had moved his capital for the safety of its surrounding marshes, Stilicho's enemies whispered poison into the young emperor's ear. They said this Vandal general, this half-barbarian, conspired with Alaric to place his own son on the throne. Honorius, weak and easily swayed, believed them. In the summer of 408, he gave the order. Stilicho, the one man who possessed the skill and the authority to hold the West together, was arrested and executed. The emperor had murdered his own shield. The consequences were immediate and disastrous. A wave of anti-barbarian violence swept through Italy, and the families of Stilicho's loyal Germanic troops were massacred. These soldiers, thousands of them, had been the backbone of the Roman army. Now, with their families dead and their commander betrayed, they had no loyalty left to the empire. They walked out of their camps, crossed the Alps, and joined Alaric. The Visigothic king, who had been driven from Italy in defeat, now found his army swelled by Rome's best-trained veterans. With no Stilicho to oppose him, the road to Rome was open. He marched south, not for conquest, but for leverage, for gold, for land, and for a place for his people within the Roman world. But the court at Ravenna, paralyzed by indecision and incompetence, refused to negotiate in good faith. Twice Alaric besieged the ancient capital. The first time the city bought him off with a fortune in gold and silver. The second time, frustrated by broken promises, he sacked it. On the 24th of August, in the year 410, the gates of Rome were opened, and for the first time in nearly 800 years, a foreign army walked its streets. The sack itself was relatively restrained by the standards of the age, lasting only 3 days. But the psychological blow was immeasurable. From Britain to Jerusalem, the news was received with shock and disbelief. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of civilization, the very symbol of order, had fallen. To many it felt as though the world itself was coming to an end. A story, perhaps invented later to capture the futility of the moment, claimed that when a servant brought the news to Honorius in Ravenna, crying, "Rome has perished," the emperor was distraught. He thought the man was speaking of his favourite pet chicken, which he had named Roma. The empire did not end that day, but it was mortally wounded. The Visigoths eventually left Italy, carving out a kingdom for themselves in southwestern Gaul. The central government, now guided by figures like Honorius's formidable half-sister, Galla Placidia, struggled to maintain a semblance of control over a shrinking domain. But another, even more fatal, blow was about to fall. In 429, the Vandals, who had rampaged across Gaul and Spain, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into North Africa. This was the empire's breadbasket, the source of the grain that fed the city of Rome, and the source of immense tax revenues that paid the army. Its loss was an economic catastrophe from which the West would never recover. The empire could no longer feed its people or fund its soldiers. The unravelling was accelerating. Into this desperate age stepped a man who would be called the last of the Romans, Flavius Aetius. A brilliant, ruthless diplomat and general who had spent his youth as a hostage among both Goths and Huns, Aetius understood the new world order better than anyone. For 2 decades he held the remnants of the Western Empire together through a masterful and exhausting balancing act. He played one barbarian tribe against another, using Hunnic mercenaries to fight Gothic federates and Frankish allies to hold the line in Gaul. He was the only thing standing between Roman civilization and total collapse. His greatest challenge came from the east, from a man whose name had become a synonym for terror, Attila the Hun. Leading a vast confederation of tribes from the steppes of Asia, Attila had already ravaged the Eastern Empire and now turned his gaze to the west. In 451 he crossed the Rhine and drove deep into Gaul. Aetius assembled his final grand army. It was a patchwork force, a coalition of Roman regulars and barbarian allies, including his old rivals, the Visigoths. On the Catalanian plains, this last army of the West met the Hunnic horde in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of antiquity. The fighting was savage, a desperate struggle that lasted late into the night. By morning, Attila had been halted. He had been defeated, and his aura of invincibility was broken. It was a great victory, but a hollow one. The empire had bled its last reserves of manpower to achieve it. What it had not yet exhausted was its capacity for self-destruction. Valentinian III came to resent the power of Aetius, as weak rulers always resent the men they cannot do without. In 454 he drew his sword in the palace and struck his greatest general down. A courtier told him, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." But the loss was worse than even that. When Stilicho died, Rome's provinces and revenues had survived him, damaged, diminished, but real enough for a capable successor to work with. What died with Aetius was something no institution could replace. 3 decades of personal relationships with the Huns and Goths that had been quietly performing the role of Roman power long after Roman power itself had gone. With Aetius gone, the final defences crumbled. The very next year the Vandals sailed from their new capital at Carthage up the Tiber and subjected Rome to a second, far more brutal sack. The political authority of the emperor dissolved almost completely. The final 2 decades of the Western Roman Empire were a grim epilogue. Real power was now held by a succession of Germanic generals, the most powerful of whom was a Swabian named Ricimer. For 16 years Ricimer was the true master of Italy, the kingmaker who appointed and deposed emperors at will. These last emperors were little more than puppets. Some reigned for a few years, others only for months. They were phantoms, their authority barely extending beyond the walls of Ravenna. One last flicker of the old Roman spirit emerged in the Emperor Majorian, a capable soldier who campaigned vigorously to reclaim Gaul and planned a great expedition to retake Africa from the Vandals. But his success threatened Ricimer's power. In 461 the kingmaker had him captured, deposed, and executed. With him died the last real hope of restoring the empire. The end, when it came, was not a thunderous crash, but a quiet, bureaucratic whisper. In 475 a general named Orestes drove out the reigning emperor and placed his own young son on the throne. The boy's name was Romulus Augustus, a name that ironically combined the founder of the city with its first emperor. He was so young that he was known to history by the derisive nickname Romulus Augustulus, the little Augustus. His reign lasted less than a year. The barbarian troops in the army, who had been Orestes' power base, demanded land in Italy. When he refused, they mutinied under their chieftain, a Skyrrian officer named Odoacer. Orestes was captured and executed. Odoacer then marched to Ravenna. There was no battle, no last stand. On September 4th, 476, Odoacer's men entered the palace. They found the boy emperor, stripped him of his purple robes, and deposed him. Odoacer spared the boy's life, sending him into a comfortable retirement in the countryside. Then he did something that no barbarian leader had done before. He did not proclaim a new puppet emperor. Instead, he gathered the imperial regalia, the diadem, the scepter, the purple cloak, and had the Roman Senate formally send them to the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople. The accompanying letter declared that the West no longer needed an emperor of its own. One emperor was sufficient for the whole world. Odoacer proclaimed himself king of Italy. There was no Roman Empire in the West anymore. The great unravelling was complete. It had not ended in fire and glory, but in the quiet packing of robes and jewels into a box and their shipment to a distant city. Chapter 4. Heirs to the Empire. The fall of an emperor did not, as it turned out, mean the fall of his empire's routines. In Ravenna, the intricate bureaucracy of the Western Empire, the tax collectors, the magistrates, the civil servants, awoke to a new reality. Their emperor was a boy in retirement. Their master was a barbarian general who now styled himself Rex Italiae, King of Italy. Odoacer, the Skyrrian officer who had so quietly ended a millennium of Roman tradition, now faced the far more difficult task of governance. He commanded a victorious army of Germanic federates, men who had followed him on the promise of land and settlement. Yet he ruled a population that was overwhelmingly, stubbornly Roman. They spoke Latin. They revered the Senate. They expected the aqueducts to run and the grain dole to be distributed. What followed was a delicate and precarious political dance. Odoacer understood that he could not rule Italy as a mere warlord. To the Romans he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate administrator within a continuing imperial framework. He treated the senators in Rome with profound respect, allowing them to continue their administrative duties and issue copper coinage in their own name, a privilege they had not enjoyed for centuries. He left the Roman civil service and its legal system almost entirely intact. For the average Italian farmer or merchant, little seemed to have changed. But to secure his authority, Odoacer needed a legitimacy that the Roman Senate alone could not grant. He needed the recognition of the one true emperor who remained, Zeno, who reigned from the unbreachable walls of Constantinople. The letter Odoacer had compelled the Senate to send, the one accompanying the returned regalia, was a masterpiece of political manoeuvring. It declared that one emperor was sufficient for the world, and it humbly requested that Zeno grant Odoacer the rank of patrician and entrust him with the administration of Italy. Zeno, however, was in a difficult position. He had received the Western regalia, a tacit acknowledgment of his supreme authority. But he could not forget the man he still considered the rightful Western emperor, Julius Nepos, who had been driven from Italy by Romulus, Augustulus' father, just a year earlier. Nepos was alive, ruling a rump state in exile from the province of Dalmatia, just across the Adriatic Sea. And so Zeno's reply to Odoacer was as shrewd as it was ambiguous. He praised Odoacer for his good sense. He granted him the title of patrician. But he also gently insisted that Odoacer should acknowledge Julius Nepos as his rightful sovereign. For a time, a strange political fiction settled over the peninsula. Odoacer, the de facto king in Ravenna, paid lip service to the authority of Nepos, the exiled emperor in Dalmatia. He even minted gold coins bearing Nepos's image and name. It was a fragile arrangement, a world of shadows and titles, where a barbarian king pretended to serve an emperor who had no real power, all under the watchful eye of a distant emperor in the East, who held the only true authority. This was the world that followed the fall of Rome. Not a smoking ruin, but a quiet continuation, a careful accommodation between the old order and the new. This delicate balance held for 4 years. Then, in the year 480, news reached Ravenna from Dalmatia. Julius Nepos, the last man to be recognized by the East as emperor of the West, had been murdered, likely by his own soldiers. The death of Nepos simplified matters for Odoacer. There was no longer a rival claimant to placate. He was now, in theory, the direct viceroy of Zeno himself. He swiftly crossed the Adriatic and annexed Dalmatia to his own kingdom, claiming he was merely punishing the assassins of the legitimate emperor. But in Constantinople, Zeno watched this consolidation of power with growing unease. Odoacer's kingdom was becoming too strong, his actions too independent. The patrician in Ravenna was beginning to look very much like a rival king. Zeno had other problems as well. Within the borders of the Eastern Empire, a large and restless population of Ostrogoths had been a source of instability for decades. Their young king was a formidable figure named Theodoric, of the noble Amal line. Theodoric had spent a decade of his youth as a political hostage in Constantinople. He had been educated in the ways of the Romans, had learned their statecraft and their military arts, but he had never forgotten that he was a Goth. Now, a king in his own right, Theodoric commanded a powerful army that the Eastern Empire could neither defeat nor fully control. He was a constant threat, sometimes an ally, always a danger. In the mind of the Emperor Zeno, 2 distant problems began to merge into a single, elegant solution. He had an unruly Gothic king he wanted out of his lands, and an overly ambitious patrician he wanted removed from Italy. In 488, Zeno made Theodoric an offer. He commissioned the Ostrogothic king to march his people into Italy, defeat Odoacer, and rule the peninsula as the emperor's representative. For Theodoric, it was the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to win a kingdom for his people, a rich and fabled land. For Zeno, the plan was flawless. If Theodoric won, a dangerous barbarian would be removed from the east and would rule Italy in Zeno's name. If Theodoric lost, two of the most powerful Germanic chieftains would have destroyed each other at no cost to the imperial treasury. The migration of the Ostrogoths was an epic undertaking. An entire nation, perhaps 100,000 people, including warriors, women, children, and elderly, with all their wagons and herds, trekked from the Balkans toward the Julian Alps. The journey was an ordeal of starvation and battle. When Theodoric's host descended into Italy in 489, Odoacer met him with a powerful army. Odoacer was a skilled commander, and the war was not the swift conquest Theodoric might have hoped for. For nearly 4 years, the two Gothic armies fought a series of brutal battles across northern Italy. Odoacer was defeated at the Isonzo River, and again at Verona. He fell back to his impregnable capital, Ravenna, a city protected by impassable marshes. Theodoric laid siege to the city, but Ravenna could be supplied by sea, and the siege dragged on and on. The war became a stalemate. Finally, in 493, with both sides exhausted and their soldiers on the verge of starvation, the Bishop of Ravenna brokered a peace. The terms were astonishing. Theodoric and Odoacer agreed to rule Italy jointly. They would share the palace in Ravenna and govern as colleagues. It was a solution born of desperation, an agreement that no one truly believed could last. 10 days after Theodoric entered the city, he invited Odoacer and his chief retainers to a great feast in the imperial palace, the Palace of Honorius. It was meant to be a banquet of reconciliation, a public display of their new partnership. Odoacer arrived, suspecting no treachery. The men sat down to eat. The historian Jordanes, writing decades later but drawing on earlier accounts, tells us what happened next. As the feast progressed, 2 of Theodoric's men, posing as petitioners, approached Odoacer and grasped his hands. It was a signal. Soldiers loyal to Theodoric, who had been hiding in alcoves, rushed out. Odoacer saw the trap too late. He was helpless. Theodoric himself stepped forward. He raised his sword high above his head and brought it down with tremendous force on Odoacer's collarbone. The blow was so powerful it was said to have cleaved the king nearly in two. As Odoacer fell, Theodoric looked down at the body and remarked with cold satisfaction, "I think the wretch had no bones in his body." Odoacer's son was executed shortly after. His loyal followers were hunted down and killed. Theodoric the Great was now the sole master of Italy. The brutal murder at the banquet was a savage beginning to what would become, paradoxically, an age of profound peace and restoration for Italy. Theodoric, having seized power through violence and betrayal, would rule for the next 33 years, not as a barbarian plunderer, but as a careful and conscientious custodian of Roman civilization. Like Odoacer before him, he ruled through a dual system. To his Gothic people, he was their tribal king. To the Roman population, he was the patrician and viceroy of the emperor in Constantinople, a legitimate ruler within the imperial system. He scrupulously preserved the Roman Senate, filling its offices with men from the most ancient and noble families. He maintained Roman law for his Roman subjects, while the Goths lived under their own traditional laws. Under his long and stable reign, Italy recovered from a century of chaos. Theodoric sponsored massive building programs. In Rome, he repaired the Colosseum and the city's aqueducts. He drained marshes to reclaim farmland and ensured the regular supply of grain to the populace. His capital, Ravenna, was adorned with magnificent new churches and a grand mausoleum for himself, monuments that blended Roman and Germanic artistic styles into something new and beautiful. Theodoric's court became a center of learning. He employed Roman scholars like Cassiodorus to run his administration, and the philosopher Boethius to translate the great works of Greek philosophy into Latin. For a generation, an Indian summer of classical culture and civic order returned to Italy. A man could travel the roads at night without fear. The laws were enforced, the fields were cultivated, and the cities were secure. The Western Roman Empire was gone. Its armies, its provinces, its emperors, all had vanished into history. But its soul, its deep legacy of law, language, and administration had not. In the kingdom of Theodoric the Ostrogoth, a barbarian king who had once been a hostage in Constantinople now sat in the palace at Ravenna, issuing edicts in flawless Latin and consulting with Roman senators. The eagle had fallen, but its heirs were now tending to its nest, preserving the light of a civilization they had conquered, and in so doing were forever changed by it. Chapter 5. The Lingering Ghost. But an Indian summer, by its very nature, cannot last. The warmth it brings is borrowed from a season that has already passed, and the chill of winter always waits to reclaim the land. So it was with the Italy of Theodoric the Great. His long and peaceful reign had been a masterful act of preservation, a careful tending of the embers of Roman civilization. Yet it was an order built on the strength of a single man, and when he died in the year 526, the delicate balance he had maintained for a generation began to fray. His heirs lacked his vision and his authority. The carefully constructed peace between the Ostrogothic military elite and the Roman senatorial class started to crumble. Intrigue, once banished from the court at Ravenna, returned like a familiar poison. And across the Adriatic, in the great city of Constantinople, a new emperor watched these developments with keen interest. He was a man of boundless ambition and restless energy, an emperor who dreamed not of preserving a fragment of the past, but of restoring its entirety. His name was Justinian. For the rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire, the state we now call Byzantium, the West had never truly been lost. It was merely occupied. In their eyes, Odoacer and Theodoric had been caretakers, ruling with the borrowed legitimacy of the one true emperor in Constantinople. Justinian saw the turmoil in the Ostrogothic kingdom not as the final decay of the West, but as a divine opportunity to reclaim what was rightfully his. He saw himself as a new Constantine, a new Augustus, destined to reunite the two halves of the world that Theodosius had put asunder. His great project began in North Africa. In a swift and brilliant campaign, his general, Belisarius, shattered the Vandal kingdom that had held the province for a century. The empire's breadbasket was restored. Next, he turned his gaze to Italy. In 535, Belisarius landed in Sicily, and what began as a campaign of restoration soon spiraled into one of the most destructive wars the peninsula had ever known. The Gothic War, as it would be called, raged for nearly 2 decades. It was a grinding, brutal affair that bled Italy white. Cities that had survived the earlier migrations and the political collapse of the 5th century were now systematically destroyed. Rome itself was besieged and captured 5 separate times by imperial and Gothic armies. Its population, which had still numbered in the hundreds of thousands even after the sacks, dwindled to perhaps 30,000 souls, huddled like ghosts among the magnificent ruins of their ancestors. The aqueducts that had supplied the city with water for centuries were cut and never fully repaired. The great marble forums became pastures for livestock. The Senate, which had convened for 1,000 years, faded into oblivion, its last recorded act an entry from the year 603. The war that was meant to restore the Roman Empire in Italy ended up destroying what was left of Roman civilization there. Justinian's reconquest was a catastrophe from which the peninsula would not recover for 1,000 years. The cure, it turned out, was infinitely more devastating than the disease. When the war finally ended in 554, Italy was a shattered, depopulated wasteland, garrisoned by Eastern Roman troops. But the empire, exhausted by plague and a long war with Persia in the east, could not adequately defend its new prize. And so, just over a decade later, in 558, a new people descended from the Alps. The Eastern Romans clung to a few coastal territories and the city of Ravenna, but the heartland of Italy now belonged to a new set of masters. The peninsula was fractured into a patchwork of warring territories. a political reality that would define it until the 19th century. This process of violent transformation was not unique to Italy. Across the map of the former Western Empire, new worlds were being born from the ashes of the old. In Gaul, the Roman administration had given way to the Franks. Their king, Clovis, who reigned at the turn of the 6th century, consolidated his power by embracing the Roman population's Catholic faith, in contrast to the Arian Christianity of other Germanic rulers. This shrewd decision allowed for a more seamless fusion of Gallo-Roman and Frankish cultures. Over generations, the Latin language of the old inhabitants blended with the Germanic tongue of the newcomers, slowly evolving into what would one day become French. The Roman province of Gaul was becoming the Kingdom of France. In Hispania, the Visigoths, the same people who had sacked Rome under Alaric, established a kingdom that mimicked Roman forms. They issued law codes based on Roman precedent, and administered their territory through the existing provincial structures. For a time, they too maintained a delicate separation between the ruling Gothic minority and the Hispano-Roman majority, a division that eventually dissolved as the two cultures merged into a new Spanish identity. And in the remote province of Britannia, which had been cut loose from the empire in the early 5th century, the transformation was perhaps the most complete. Waves of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes crossed the North Sea, overwhelming the native Romano-British population. In this land, the legacy of Rome was almost entirely erased. Its language vanished, its cities were abandoned, and its Christian faith was replaced by pagan worship. The island, once on the edge of the Roman world, would become the heart of a new one, England. So, when did the Roman Empire truly fall? Was it in 410, when the sanctity of the Eternal City was violated by Alaric's Goths? Was it on that quiet September day in 476, when a boy named Romulus handed his crown to a barbarian general? Or was it in the desolate ruins of Rome in the 50s, after Justinian's armies had come and gone, leaving only silence? The truth, as it so often is in history, is that there was no single moment. There was no thunderous crash. The end of the Roman world was not an event, but a long, slow, and complex process. It was a gradual unravelling that lasted for generations. For the farmer working his field in Gaul, or the merchant in the Spanish port, life went on. The tax collector might have a new name and speak a new language, but the sun still rose, the seasons still turned, and the fundamental patterns of life remained. What disappeared was the great overarching structure, the political and military unity maintained by legions and enforced by governors that had held the Mediterranean world together for half a millennium. This structure had been a great machine, and for centuries it had provided peace, law, and a shared identity. But the machine grew too old, too vast, and too complex. It broke down under the immense pressures of internal conflict, economic strain, and the ceaseless movement of peoples along its frontiers. And yet the ghost of that machine would haunt the world that followed in ways both generative and destructive. Rulers from Charlemagne to the Habsburgs would claim the mantle of Roman emperor, but the deeper lesson of the Gothic War went largely unlearned, that the very ambition to restore Rome had destroyed more of Roman civilization than the barbarians ever had. The ghost was not only an inheritance, it was an obsession. And obsessions have consequences. What actually endured was not Rome itself, but Rome's impression left in the world, the groove of Latin running through every Romance tongue, the outline of ancient dioceses preserved in episcopal boundaries, the memory of universal law embedded in 100 emerging legal codes. These were not continuations. They were echoes, fragments of a frequency still audible long after the source had gone silent. That hunger, as much as any surviving law code or aqueduct, was the true inheritance of the fallen empire. Not preservation, but perpetual longing, and the restless effort, sometimes creative, sometimes ruinous, to fill the immense space where Rome once stood.